Good to see everyone. I think it's about time. We'll go ahead and dive in, and if others join us, they join. Hey,
Morning.
oh, Justin and Fallon.
We are doing well. How are y'all doing?
Good, good. All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and dive in here. I'm gonna switch over to gallery view here for the video. So, okay, well, good to see everyone here. This is our second session of Old Testament survey, and we're not gonna be going in order of the books today and last week, but once we get past this, we'll kind of be going in order as we go through chapters of the book. If you have the book, it's great. If not, it's not necessary. You can just join in, and we'll just go from there. But good to see everyone. I wanted to start and see if there are any questions folks have beforehand that I can kind of be paying attention to or be thinking about. Abby? Okay.
I'm sorry to reveal my ignorance, but when is the diaspora?
Okay. I'll go ahead and answer that right now. The diaspora comes in various stages. The Jews are dispersed starting in around the 700s BC up in the north. The Assyrians come in. Then around 580 BC, Babylonian captivity happens. There's more diaspora later on. There's some reshuffling with the Persians, the Greeks, but the diaspora, so there are many different mini diasporas. Probably the biggest one where they really got pushed out completely for the most part is after 70 AD when the Romans came in and turned Jerusalem into a Roman town instead of a Jewish town for the next 1900 years, basically. So there are many diasporas, but that it refers to the Jews being dispersed into the Mediterranean and around the world. That's a good question. Jimmy, yeah.
Not necessarily to take too much time. Could you maybe mention or something about the divine council? Because that's kind of a weird.
The divine council in Genesis 1?
In Genesis 1 and how that plays out with Trinity or
okay.
Angels and everything.
I'll note that. Anything else? Yeah, Bob.
So, are Jay, I hate to be very wooden or very, very almost pharisaical in my thinking, but are J, E, D, and P and all other forms of interpretative theories, do they help us understand the Bible?
Okay.
Or does it just help PhDs, students get dissertations so they can then get the credentials to teach the Bible?
Very good. That's a good question. I'll touch on that in just a few moments here. Good. Any other questions before we start here? All right. Well, I do want to spend a little time with J, E, P, and D. I don't want to spend too much time. I think historically we've actually given it too much weight in the past, but I do want to spend a few moments with it. I am going to bring up, I've got a little PowerPoint again this week, not as big as last week. Let's see if I can get this sharing here. Okay, does everybody see my PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Okay, so the first thing we looked at was today. Wanted y'all to read chapter 2. I know if you haven't ever encountered J, E, D, and P, it might be confusing. It might seem esoteric, and Bob's question is very good. Does it really matter unless you're working on a PhD dissertation? Just really quickly, a quick summary. Oh, come on. There it goes. A quick summary. It looks like, and this is something that was discovered, the last century, the last century, 19th century. The work started on this. When you're reading through the Torah, especially, and it really was dealing with the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy at first. They noticed there were different layers. That at different times God was called different things, and so they started to hypothesize that there were different layers in the composition of the Torah. traditionally Moses was the author of the Torah, but really that tradition only started about 200 BC and was already being questioned about 200 AD, 300 AD. So it wasn't something that everybody had always assumed for all eternity. And so, in fact, the great Saint Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, thought that maybe the priest Ezra compiled the Torah, which is actually not a bad theory. It probably was about that time period. But anyway, if you look at the dates, J is the oldest. J is named for Yahweh. German starts with a J. Probably 950-ish, so sometime right after the reign of King David. About 100 years later, there's some traditions from the north after the Civil War, where God is called Elohim pretty exclusively, and so that's labeled E for Elohim. Later on, the book of Deuteronomy is either discovered or rediscovered, or shared at that point. And so there's a D layer from the 650s, and then a P layer, 550 or so, after the Babylonian exile, after Jerusalem fell and everybody went to Babylon. So it looks like we do have these layers. I've got a Bible on the shelf that has everything color-coded. You can look at any page of the Torah and say what scholars, or at least those scholars, think the layering is. There's a graphic in the text that looks like that. Very, very similar. No, in fact, this is actually from the text itself. So J the oldest, E and maybe combined, and then really after the Babylonian exile, this was all kind of pulled together. Now, like Darwin's theory of evolution, Charles Darwin started evolutionary thought in the 1860s. And while everybody accepts evolution today in the biological world, or just about everybody does, absolutely no one views it in strict Darwinian terms from 1860. There have been many updates, many changes. Darwin believed in a steady state, a gradual progression. It looks like it stair steps. We don't need to go into all that. But this model, there are very few scholars that would even begin to say this is the model. What they would say is probably the model is a little more complex. So just take a snapshot with your brain of this diagram. And this is probably the diagram that most scholars think is actually the case. So a little more complex. You've got several pieces of the D tradition that scholars talk about. We don't need to worry about all that. But I would highlight a couple things. One, they've added something called DH down here in the corner, which is Deuteronomist history. So the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, probably also come out of this same D school of thought in some way. We don't need to go into large detail about those books. We'll touch on them later. But there still is the idea that there are strains of J, E, P, and D that have been brought into the 5 books of Moses. But today, a lot of people also talk about R. What is R? R is the redactor, the final editor. And perhaps the redactor is far more important than any of these other layers, because this is the person who picked and chose and wove these disparate strands together into what we have today. And so whereas most scholars, including those with PhDs, Bob, most scholars will think of it in these terms. It really is not the be-all and the end-all that it used to be. In the 1950s, 1960s, this was the main thrust of Old Testament scholarship. This was the main thrust of what was taught in seminary. You got to get these sources right. Today, folks are more concerned about what we have. We have it in this finalized form. It has been edited together in this finalized form. And probably the final form is more important to us, and probably to the church, and probably even to the academy than all the layers. We acknowledge the layers are there, but the totality, the pendulum has shifted, so the totality is more important these days than all the pieces parts. If a geologist goes to the Grand Canyon, they're going to see layers. If they study one particular layer, they might be more interested in that layer. But most people are going to see the canyon with layers and know that the layers are there. But the emphasis of the Grand Canyon is not the individual layers, it's the totality of the canyon. And I think that's probably a good viewpoint for us to keep. And so I'm not going to spend much more time on this, but I do want you all to be aware that it is out there and want to just spend a moment with it. Because it especially impinges on the creation stories, because we have 2 creation stories in Genesis. One of them is from the P layer, the P source, and one of them is from the J source. And we'll talk about the P one this week, and the J one, the older one, we'll talk about next week. And so that is really more of the reason I wanted to spend 10 minutes on it now than at some other point. So questions or thoughts before I segue off of this or toggle off this? John?
Yeah, Jim, the thing I found interesting about all these sources is there are different conceptions of God.
Yes.
So it goes from superhuman to something more ephemeral.
In the creation stories especially, we'll see this. Next week in the chapter 2 and 3 creation story, God is very much hands-on. God walks in the garden. God is very anthropomorphic. God molds humanity out of the dust of the earth. God in the P creation story, the Genesis 1 creation story, is much more transcendent, more distant, speaks commands from afar. He doesn't get hands-on in the same way. And so, we do see those different views of God. So that's a fascinating piece of all of this. Yeah, other questions about source theory before we move on?
I have one,
Yeah.
or just a comment. In reading the P section, he comments that P is in the beginning of Genesis, at the beginning, and then it's also at the end of Deuteronomy.
Mhm.
And so I think about P being the priest, and I thought about Jesus as our high priest. And so it's, I kind of thought, well, the beginning and the end and the whole covering, our high priest is, anyway, there might be some, I just thought that was an interesting.
And the final editor is probably pulling from P sources and probably is of the P mindset more than anything. And so that's a hugely important layer. Certainly is. And it certainly starts out with the creation stories that way. Well, this week we are going to look at the P creation story, the Genesis 1:1 through 2:4a creation story. The other creation story starts in the middle of verse 4. Remember, verse numbers, chapter numbers were added much, much, much later. They were not in original Old Testament or New Testament documents. Chapters were added before verses. And so the two stories look like they get split in the middle of a verse. And so that just is an accident of the people that went in and added the versification. So interestingly, we encounter the Genesis 1 story first in the beginning, or when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And yet that is the later creation story. The earlier creation story that had been passed down is the J story, the Garden of Eden, all of that. We'll talk about that in a fair amount of detail next week. I want to talk about creation stories in general. This is something that kind of throws us because we live in a scientific era. We live in an era also that privileges the discipline of history. And we often will look at things with glasses of history and science. And when we say history and science, we mean 19th and 20th and 21st century history and science. We don't mean the way the Romans did history or whatever. That's a whole different thing. But in the Near East, when the Genesis stories were being generated, and when the Genesis and the Torah was finally kind of collated and combined, history was not a discipline. It had really not been invented yet in the way we understand it. Science was off the radar screen completely. It had not yet come about. Philosophy was being invented in another part of the world about that time. What's the guy? Thales of Miletus was inventing philosophy just about the same time, but it wouldn't take off until you had Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. So philosophy was burgeoning somewhere else, or just in its infancy somewhere else, but it really was not there. So if I was a person wanting to talk about God, wanting to talk about what God does, history is not a tool available to me. Science is not a tool available to me. Philosophy is not a tool available to me in the Near East. So really, the way that they thought and the way they said who God was, what the universe is like, all of those things, the only way to talk about deep things was through story or parable or narrative. Really, it's the only hammer they had in the toolbox. They didn't have other tools to use. Story was the way they conveyed things. And there's something in the Middle East about that. Even today, they love to tell stories. Think about Jesus. Jesus, tell us about God. Jesus, who is my neighbor? Well, a guy was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, fell among some robbers. Well, no, who's my neighbor? Well, let me tell you the story. And then you can figure out who your neighbor is. Or Jesus, what's God the Father? What's the Father like? Well, a guy had two sons. And the one son, the younger son said, give me all my money, give me my inheritance. He goes off and blows it. And then he comes back to his father, repentant, and the father, probably parable of the prodigal son. So Jesus, even when talking about God, doesn't usually sit there and give, well, the philosophical discourse I'm going to give about God starts with X. No, Jesus tells stories. And so very much in the Middle Eastern world, that's the way that they tried to make sense of where they came from, where they were going. Let me get to the next slide here. So ancient Near Eastern peoples would use narrative or story to explain these fundamental questions of the universe. They would want to talk about how the world is now. And they often use creation stories to explain now. It's not just about explaining how it was back then or where we came from, though that's a piece of it, but how is the world structured now and why is it structured that way? Near Eastern creation stories, we also often talk about who the gods are and where the gods came from. And we'll talk about that with Genesis 1, because that's something missing in Genesis 1, which is kind of cool. They also used these stories to talk about the structure or purpose or nature of reality. And they would do it in poetic story form because that was the tool they had. In a real way, I'm a chemistry major, and so we use a document that looks like this, or chart that looks like this, to talk about the nature of reality. Does this tell us everything there is to know about reality? No, but there's a lot of great information here on the periodic table. It doesn't necessarily say where hydrogen came from or where helium comes from, where carbon comes from. There are other scientific disciplines that talk about that and how they're birthed in the hearts of stars. But this gives us a structure that says these things are related in this way, and we can kind of make sense of our natural world using a tool like the periodic table. Or I'm a biology minor, so we have a whole discipline of taxonomy in biology, where you try to classify every organism, animal, plant, whatever, using kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so we try to make sense of the large picture using these kinds of tools. In a very real way, the story of Genesis 1 is one of these kind of tools to try to set things into their context, into their place in the universe, to say this is the way things are. This is why we're created. This is who God is in relation to us. This is what our nature is like. This is what God's nature is like. So they're trying to make sense of the world with creation stories in the same way we might use other tools here. So far, so good? All right, so here's a chart. I got this out of a great course, and there were some gaps. I think the professor that taught the great course on Old Testament didn't generate the chart. I think they probably had somebody in the office generate it, because there were some gaps and a couple errors. So the black is the original chart that I found. The red is my additions to it. But if you look at the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1, they really are trying to make sense of the world. There are patterns and there are repeats. There are things that come up again and again. We won't go through all of these necessarily in detail. But there is, as was in your book, a marvelous parallelism. On the first day, light is created, light and dark. And then on the fourth day, you've got lamps or lights in the sky that are created that are kind of in parallel. 1 and 4 kind of play off each other. 2 and 5 play off each other. You've got the dome, the expanse created to separate the waters. You've got the waters above, the waters below, sky and sea. And then on day 5, the fish and birds are created in those different realms. Day 3, the land is separated out and plants are created on day 3. Day 6, land animals and human beings are created. So there's some wonderful parallelism here. There's some separating that goes on in the earlier days of creation that's not so much present in the later days, though there is some separation in 4. God says it's good, good, but he ends up by saying it's very good. The first 3 days of creation, God names things, and the last 3 days he does not, which is an interesting pattern. Also, this is something hugely important. God delegates things in creation. Let the earth bring forth, and the earth brings forth. God gives commands, and the earth does it. God delegates to his creation certain things. And certain things are able to make copies of themselves. Plants and animals and human beings are able to reproduce. And that's also part of the structure here.
Jim?
Yeah, go ahead, Becky.
The question about your chart there, when you say separating yes and no, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, on day one, the light is separate from the darkness. The waters above on day two are separated from the waters below. The land and the waters are separated on day three. So part of what God's doing is pushing back. And this also goes back, we have an idea, we've got the Big Bang, which, was thought of in the 1930s by a priest, by the way, who was also a brilliant mathematician, and confirmed by Hubble with the redshift. Anyway, we don't need to go into all that. But we think of creation ex nihilo, from nothing, in a vacuum. That was not the way the folks in the Near East thought about things. They thought about the waters of creation. What's the first sentence? In the beginning, or when God began to create the heavens and the earth, it was formless and void. Darkness was over the face of the waters, the face of the deep. So there were already these chaotic, pre-existent waters. And part of what God does is separate and delineate and push and make boundaries in the midst of chaos. God literally imposes order in the midst of chaotic waters. And that's an important piece of what God does in the first Genesis creation story.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And I'll jump to this slide. So this was in your book. So really this was their mental picture, that you've got all these waters. I'm pointing to my screen, that will help you. You've got all these waters that are all over the place, and yet God creates some boundaries, and God separates things out into different regions and different areas. And there are still waters below and waters above, and there are fountains below that bring forth rivers and floods. There are openings in the sky that allow rain to come in. Later in the Noah story, God opens all the corks, pulls all the openings, and the floods come from both directions, from below and from above. So it is very much kind of their worldview. But the idea of separating out and God making a safe space in the midst of chaos, God creating order in the midst of chaos, is very much a part of the Genesis creation story. All right, one of the things that our text talked a lot about the Enuma Elish, or you sometimes hear pronounced the Enema Elish. That sounds too much like a medical cleansing procedure. So I usually say Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish is a Babylonian story. It predates Genesis by millennia. It goes way, way back. But in that story, you've got the god Marduk wading out into the waters to fight the serpent in the midst of chaos, and kills the serpent and all that. There are a lot of parallel stories. In fact, the gods, little g, create usually by two means in most world creation stories, either through sex or through violence, or sometimes through both. You read just about any culture's creation stories, and it's usually some kind of sexual procreation that goes on, or there's some kind of war. Norse creation mythology, I mean, you got people killing giants and turning their skulls into the dome of the sky. Egyptians, you've got sexuality involved in creation, being birthed and born. God is extremely different from all that. There's no battle in Genesis 1. There's no procreation. God does not meet a female god and procreate and create the world. God just commands, and it happens. If you were Bob the Babylonian, or Mo the Moabite, or Eddie the Egyptian, this would be one of the most bizarre things you'd ever heard. What kind of God is this that brings forth order out of nothing, out of chaos, just by giving a command? Not by battling, not by doing all these other things, just by giving a command. In the ancient world, the Genesis story really stands alone, and is an amazing, amazing thing that God creates by fiat, just by commanding, by saying the word, and it happens, which is an amazing, amazing thing. The other thing God does oftentimes, and God, commands, as we said, and things come forth. God says to the land, bring forth plants, and the earth brings forth plants. So God commands creation to do some parts of creating. God is not hands-on in the first story. God allows creation to take place. One of the reasons I have absolutely no problem with evolutionary theory and Genesis 1, absolutely no problems whatsoever. God is often asking creation to participate in the creative process. And so if God chooses to do that through let the earth bring forth, and there's natural selection involved in millions and billions of years, I have absolutely no problem with any of that. So that piece is absolutely unique in the Genesis 1 creation story. Another thing that's absolutely unique, every other group tells about where their gods came from. Well, there were these titans, you see, and one of the titans had a kid named Zeus, and Zeus killed his father and ripped his brother gods and goddesses out. No, there's none of that stuff. God is. God doesn't come from somewhere. God isn't created by something. God doesn't spring forth from something. In Genesis, the book starts and God is there. God exists. And it's fascinating. What's the name of God? This is a JSource thing, but what's the name of God? I am who I am, or I am who I'll be, or I'll be who I'll be, or I am whoever I want to be. But that idea that God is the ground of being. God is not something created. God just is. So there's no theogony. There's no origin story for God in either of the Genesis creation stories.
Father Jim?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Moving beyond the Levant and the Fertile Crescents,
Yeah.
would it be fair to say that, and even North America, Native America, Europe, India, Japan, China, would it be fair to say that the Genesis story is unique among all creation stories, in the sense of God is kind of the unmoved mover only in Genesis and nowhere else?
I have not encountered anywhere else where God just is presupposed. Yeah, Bob, I'd agree with that. And also, these other cultures also have procreation or battle usually in their creation stories as well. And so really, world, not just Near East, but worldwide, I think that's, there may be something out there that I haven't seen or that I've missed, but that's my understanding, certainly.
Following up real quick, interestingly, because having heard the Old Testament, what we called the Pentateuch growing up,
right,
which isn't even the right Jewish word either, but
right.
I heard but didn't pay a lot of attention. Nobody would be surprised to know that I probably fell asleep in synagogue. But listening, I really like to listen to the Episcopal prayer through Alexa in the morning and the evening, morning and evening prayer, where you get the recitation of the lessons. And in this week started, or I guess the end of last week started, Esther, the Haman story and Ahasuerus and all that stuff,
right,
where the king says, "Who are these people?" to his counselors, and somebody describes, well, they started out here, and then they moved to and then they didn't like these gods, and they came up with their own god, and here they are.
Here they are.
It's kind of an interesting, within the Bible, it explains not the creation. Of course, the Bible does explain it, but within Esther, explains the creation of what became the Jews.
I think that's a fascinating thing. Yes, I think and certainly, the Esther stories, Persian period is just a tad later than the Babylonian period. So the Pentateuch was already probably out there at that point. But I think that's a fascinating parallel, Bob. Very good. The other thing our book was very, very clear on, I want to make sure to mention this. Bob the Babylonian or Eddie the Egyptian would be shocked that the sun, the moon, the stars were created later on. They were on the fourth day. They were not divine in and of themselves. In fact, the book talks about, I believe, that they don't even use the term sun and moon, but the greater light and the lesser light, even though they had Hebrew words for sun and moon, just to make sure you didn't think they were gods. They are creations of God. They are not divine in and of themselves. And that would have been real. Bob the Babylonian would have thought that was heresy. What do you mean my God's not a God? My God's a creature, a light. My God's a lot more than a light in the sky. I worship the sun. The sun is mighty. Well, no. The heavenly bodies just created things. The other thing that's fascinating is that God continually calls creation good. And humans are called very good, the pinnacle of creation. And most other cultures, and our book does allude to this, most other cultures have humanity made to serve the gods, to do the gods' dirty work, to serve the gods, to do what the gods don't want to do, to offer worship to the gods so the gods can kind of sit back and take it easy. But in Genesis, God gives his creatures dominion. They are created in the image of God, which means they are like God, and they are given dominion, which means they are charged with God's authority in the world. And so that also would have been an extremely, extremely different thing compared to other cultures. And so the 6-day creation story, the 7-day creation story in Genesis 1:1 through 2:4a, in the context of the other cultures around the world, just stands out in glowing neon as something very, very different. Who is our God in this? Well, our God creates powerfully by speaking. Our God creates us to be like him and to have dominion. Our God creates everything. The sun and moon and stars aren't gods in and of themselves. They're creatures. They're creations of our God. And so it really is an amazing, amazing difference. And part of, I'm going to go and stop sharing here for a second. So part of the reason for exploring the Enuma Elish, things like that, is to see how different things are. Those documents were kind of lost for a long time. When they were rediscovered in the 19th century, people went, whoa, look at this. What would the Genesis story be like in juxtaposition to this story, which is absolutely an amazing thing. Okay, I've been talking quite a bit. Let's see if anybody has questions. I'm going to say a few more things here too. But,
Jim?
yeah.
Speaking of, you said the Egyptian man would have trouble not realizing that the moon and the stars and the sun were not gods, but rather they were created, that God created them. So, I mean, that's all well and good. So cultures a long time, and even today, like Native American cultures, they don't worship sun, moon, and stars, but they think of it like the Native people think that hawks carry their prayers to God, and they think of these cycles of the seasons as a way to God. So how is that really different than, say, the Catholic faith, who prays through Mary rather than directly to God? Can that be thought of as in different ways, or is it kind of the same?
In some ways, you might think about it in those terms. That's not Genesis's point at all. But in the Hebrew thought as well, in ancient Near East, burning of sacrifices, smoke would carry things up to God, the gods, and to God in the Bible. Incense would carry prayers up to God, and so there are some things like that are intermediaries in many cultures, including in the Jewish world. But the Jewish world is unique in saying that their God is the God of everything. There aren't sub-gods. Think of pantheons. You've got maybe a top god, but then there are all these underling gods. So Zeus is in charge of everything, but he's got his brother Poseidon who's in charge of the ocean, and his brother Hades is in charge of the underworld. So you've got a whole pecking order here. Egyptian gods, you've got those same kind of subdivisions. But the Jews said, no, there's just one guy. one God, one creator who were created in his image, male and female. Interesting. And so it really does stand head and shoulders above all those other systems of thought and systems of mythology that the other cultures have.
Okay.
Jimmy. Oh, Jimmy, you're muted, bud.
Sorry, but that kind of monotheism, which is present in this creation story, is not going to be in the next one or in a lot of the Torah either. And it's going to take a while to flesh that all out.
It's a good point. When this creation story is generated, when it's edited down to its final form, monotheism had started emerging as an idea of the Jewish people. The term is emerging monotheism because as Scripture goes through its trek, God is not always assumed to be the only God. He's the top God, but it takes centuries until the Jewish people say God is not just the number one God. Our God's number one, yours is number two, but our God's the only God, and anything else is an idol and is not really a God. And so Jimmy is right. There is an emerging monotheism that will take place, and we're having this first story front loaded. And probably the final redactor, the final editor of Genesis loaded this up front to make sure that we got that. We're not going to start with the older creation story where God, is hands-on and molding the man out of the dust of the earth and breathing into him. Though there's some spiritual truth in that story as well. We'll talk about that next week. But yeah, you're exactly right, Jimmy. The other thing Jimmy asked me earlier was about the divine council. You do get a sense. God does talk in the plural in Genesis 1. Let us make human beings in our image. And so who is God talking about in the plural there? Is he talking to the angels that are around him? Is he talking to the other members of the Trinity? There are some Christians that would see this later on. It's a good question. So there's some hint of a pecking order. There's some hint of a heavenly court, or maybe God's just using the royal we, and that's also another thought. Let us make God in our image, let's just make humans in our image, God says. Yeah, Bob.
Knowing that, of course, these tales were told. It was oral tradition for not years, but hundreds, centuries, maybe a millennia.
And especially, let me interrupt, especially with Genesis 2:3, that's an old story, and that probably was passed down quite a while. Go ahead.
Sure, but you can picture when would they be retelling the stories around the campfire at night? Mm-hmm. You can picture a nomadic people sitting around the fires at night, and the description is what you would see probably in the desert. I think about, I usually leave the house when it's still dark, and especially if I see the crescent moon and the couple of stars you can see or planets in Lubbock, how, for instance, the symbol of Islam is the crescent and the star, because that's what they saw in the desert. Mm. But you can also picture the Genesis 1 being recited as a chant, almost as a group chant. The priest or the storyteller or the bard starting out saying, God said this and this happened, and the people responding, and it was good. Almost like a chant, almost like the way here Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, other great orators, with the repetition that reinforces the story.
It does, and there's certainly, that's an important piece of the Genesis 1 rhythm. You have this repetitive pattern on each of the days. It was evening and morning the first day. It was evening and morning the second day, and God, you do get these wonderful repeats. Well, just a couple of things. We're not going to have a ton of time here, but let's pull up my Bible here. So one of the things that the book did mention, we say in the beginning, and a better translation is probably when God began to create. The idea is that the Genesis 1 writer, the priestly writer, is probably not trying to talk about the beginning so much as this is how God creates. This is how God makes order out of chaos. And so, you know, the book did mention that. We do get light and dark first day, second day, domes, all of this stuff. Jump down here. Preachers, all that, and then finally humankind. This image of God bit. This is something we don't want to discount, being made in the image of God, male and female. That somehow we are like God. Now, is that a physical image? Probably something much more spiritual. We also create. We also have dominion over creation because God's given it to us. There were some people that got locked into this. God must be a male because, or a human because, you know, we're created in His image. Well, it's probably something much deeper than just physicality. But then there's this wonderful command of giving dominion over everything, and that's and as we said, not only is it good, but it's very good. That human beings are the pinnacle of creation in the first Genesis story. And then there's that bit in chapter 2, the beginning of chapter 2, about God resting. And you know, the priestly writers, the Sabbath would have been an important aspect of the way the world functioned, the way the religion functioned. And so they make sure to explain where the Sabbath came from, that was something God did on the seventh day. And of course, we could go through all those verses in detail, but we're not going to have time to do all of that. Well, one thing though, and this is something, I was watching a documentary, and most of you know my training's in chemistry with a biology minor. I was watching some documentary that had high-end CGI for the time. It was probably 2010 or 2011, and kind of going through the history of the Earth as we best knew it at that point from science, what it was like. And it hit me, if I were a priest and I was given a CGI vision like this of creation, would what I wrote down be that different from Genesis 1? It's kind of weird to us that sun, moon, and stars are made on the fourth day. But if you remember scientifically, you know, the atmosphere was so thick you could not see through it for the longest time until plants were created and thinned that atmosphere out to where you were able to see through it, where there weren't continual cloud cover. And so the sun and moon and stars wouldn't be visible until after plants came about. Interesting. And really, if you go through it that way, the only thing that's out of place is the birds. You can line up the Genesis creation story with what we think of as, from a geocentric position, what we think of as the way creation happened scientifically. And I can make a pretty good argument. I'm not going to take the time to do that here, but I think that's a fascinating possibility, that maybe there was some vision in the temple from one of these priestly folks, and somehow that got incorporated into this. Just Jim Haney's kooky theory number 107, but just something I'll throw in there too. You know, that was a lot of stuff really quick, y'all. Any questions or thoughts or comments here? Well, for next time, we'll look at the second creation story, the older creation story, the one, as Bob said, it probably really was for a long time, passed down around that campfire. You know, compiled probably around the time of King David, but probably dating back well into the desert period, with the nomads telling this story around the campfire. It's a much different story than Genesis 1 is, and yet Genesis 1, I would say, contains tremendous spiritual truth, and Genesis 2 and 3 contain tremendous spiritual truth. If you want them to be historical in the way we understand history in the modern world, then you might run into trouble. If you try to use them as a science textbook, you might run into trouble. But if you're looking for information about who we are and who God is, we still heavily rely on Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 to tell us who we are and who God is spiritually. And so part of our problem in our world, we've privileged history so much that if it's true, it must be historical, or if it's historical, it must be true, and everything else gets filtered out. Well, Can you find truth? Is there truth in the story of the prodigal son? You better believe it. Was there a prodigal son? Probably not. But in that story that Jesus tells, there's tremendous information and truth about who God is and who we are in relation to God. And so I look at the Genesis stories in very much the same way, as parable, as story. Now, one last thing. I'm 29 seconds over here, but we'll go for a second longer. There is a term I have refrained from using because it's a loaded term, but it's technically a good term, and the term is myth. A mythological story is something that explains the way things are. We have taken it to mean, because of our privileging of history, the opposite of historically true is myth. That's not at all when scholars of stories talk about them as myths. They're talking about stories that convey deep truth. So that's why I use the word parable sometimes, because that's a little easier for folks to hear. Myth causes all kinds of alarm bells to go off historically. But these are creation myths, and with a capital M and all that. And I would say that they are true, capital T. They might not be true in every historical detail, but that's not the point of them. They are to explain who we are, the way the universe is, who God is in relation to us, and who we are in relation to God. So, any other final thoughts here? Okay, y'all. We'll pick up next time, and we'll look at the second half of chapter 1, and that'll be the Genesis 2 and 3 creation stories. And then we'll follow along, looking at the other chapters in the book in order for the rest of this course. So that's the game plan. Good to see y'all. We'll see you later. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.